Wisconsin's packed summer. This week, we're going to be having a series of podcasts called Packed Lunch, and we are excited to be joined from Acme Packing Company. You can read all his great work there, catch all the great podcasts he does over there. Also, follow him on Twitter at JUMOSQ. He is Justis Mosqueda joining Packed Lunch, as you did right after the season ended. Justis, really appreciate you jumping on, man.
Yeah, man. Whenever you guys need me, just tap me on the shoulder, put me in, coach.
Yeah, well, today, this week we have mandatory minicamp. It's the last time the Packers are going to get together this offseason as a full team until we hit training camp at the end of July. So, where I want to start today, because I feel like it's been largely ignored, and understandably so. The Packers traded a future Hall of Famer, a four-time MVP. They're giving the reins to their heir apparent that they drafted and started this whole thing. But the defense, they continue to just pour money. They continue to pour first-round picks into it. Last year, they took a step back under Joe Barry's second year. They finished 17th in points. They finished 17th in yards allowed. What are realistic steps for this Packers defense to take forward this year?
Honestly, it's kind of hard to tell other than players improving in general. And I know that sounds like a terrible answer, but you look at if you would have asked me kind of like what some of the weaker positions, on the team were in general, right? Like coming into the draft, probably would have said, tight end, receiver, ones that they addressed, but then also the defensive line where the highest guy that they ended up taking was Wooden, who's an undersized but athletic kind of guy who was drafted in the fourth round. And then safety, they didn't even address until the seventh. How many mock drafts did we see this year with Brian Branch going to the Packers in the first round, and they don't even go safety until the seventh round? So I kind of think their run defense is just going to be bad this year. I just don't think they have the bodies at defensive end, and I think safety is still a little iffy, even if Darnell Savage, does take that next step and kind of bounces back from his performance last year where he ended up getting benched, mid-season for Rudy Ford, who's now probably going to be a week one starter. But I think if you look at like the individual guys, like you want to see Lucas Van Ness look the part, right? You want to see Quay Walker and Devondre Campbell just like look like anywhere near the amount of money those guys are being paid, right?
Well, when it starts with Van Ness, I guess my expectations aren't high there just because it's kind of been already pitched the same way it was pitched, by the way, with Rashawn Gary when the Packers drafted him in the first round, where, okay, this guy, he's going to be a bit of a project. Like the raw tools are there. We just need to get him in our pro style system. We need to get him going. We need to coach him up, and then he's going to continue to progress. I guess my expectations for him aren't very high. I think Rashawn Gary had something like 2 sacks his rookie year. But at the same time, he was also playing behind Preston and Za'Darius.
Right.
Van Ness, presumably going to be playing behind Gary and Preston Smith, depending upon the health of Rashawn Gary once we hit the opening of the season. The problem I guess I have with the defense, Justis, is when you start going through the depth chart, I feel like everybody but, and maybe you could talk me into Kenny Clark in this as well, but everybody but Jair Alexander has a huge if next to their name. Like, oh, if this guy, again, I can run through it right now. If TJ Slayton continues to progress, if Devontae Wyatt actually gets playing time, you already hit it with the 2 inside linebackers. If Preston Smith can play, can continue to play the way he has, but he's getting older, so who knows? If Rashawn Gary is back healthy, if Rasul Douglas can play like he did 2 years ago, if Eric Stokes is healthy and playing outside, Keyshawn Nixon getting the first real opportunity to presumably be the slot corner. Can he be good enough to play in the slot and basically be a starter within this defense? If Rashawn Gary is healthy, if Darnell Savage plays like he did his first couple years in the league, it just seems like there's way too many ifs. And if I'm banking on that many ifs, and I have an offense that's going to be as young as it is, that makes me very concerned about the defense, especially given Joe Barry, now in 6 seasons as a defensive coordinator, hasn't really shown the ability to get it done.
I don't disagree with you at all. And that's kind of the spot I've been sitting in. And one of the things I really find interesting is just from a contractual standpoint, right? So Joe Barry, like you mentioned, he's coming in third season. Usually contracts for coordinators aren't beyond 3 years. So you would assume, for some reason we don't really cover contracts for coaches in the same way that we do the players. But you would assume this is basically like a contract year for Joe Barry, and with all those ifs almost being like baked into this season, and us knowing like, hey, it's a rebuilding year and we're taking our medicine, and a lot of that right now is coming on the defensive line and at safety, right? Probably the two weakest positions on the team. How do we even evaluate Joe Barry if we're coming into it with all those ifs and stuff? And like, if they win enough ball games, I'll give you one if they win enough ball games, does Matt LaFleur end up bringing him back? I could see a scenario like that. And I'm not totally sold that Barry is the guy.
Yeah, I would have thought that he would have been gone at the end of this past season, but that ended up not being the case. So I have to leave the possibility, unless the defense is an absolute dumpster fire. Like, they were an average defense. Again, as I mentioned, they finished 17th across the board last year. They were an
The
average
the the
defense
problem
at
is
best.
they're average when you look at the end of the season stats, but on a game by game basis, they could have been
Oh
anywhere. It
yeah,
was roller coaster.
they gave up 400 plus yards rushing in a game.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, what are we doing? Like, what are we? And again, some of that is personnel, but at the same time, I know the number one thing I feel that we get when callers call in the morning show, Jen, Gabe, and Chewy 7 to 9 on ESPN Milwaukee, like, I feel the number one complaint for most fans are it's 3rd and 3. Why the hell are the corners 8 yards off the line of scrimmage?
And
So
that's
like, if it's just little things like that, where if you clean some of that up, you can talk me more into Joe Barry. But until little stuff like that gets cleaned up, I can't even trust him on big picture stuff.
so that's a really good point. I have a couple of thoughts on that. So I
Okay.
think the beginning of the season there was a lot of miscommunication in the secondary in general. Like when we were watching those wide open crossers, right? And it's just like they aren't trusting the structure of the defense.
Mm-hmm.
But then I also think they struggle at tackling at times. And I don't know how you do it.
Putting
Like,
it mildly.
yeah, I mean, well, especially at safety, like Savage and Ford is going to be a really interesting pairing because neither of those guys is Adrian Amos. And I know the legs came off of Adrian Amos last year, but it's going to be interesting to see how that ends up working out. The off coverage thing is kind of like really interesting because it's a interesting problem to have at the NFL level. So basically what happens, right? Like it's 3rd and 8, let's call it, right? They know, like the opposing offense knows, hey, we have to get a pretty decent sized chunk play here. They're probably going to press the hell out of us. Their defensive ends are going to have their ears pinned back, just like wanting to tear through that tackle. How do we buy ourselves a little bit more time? What ends up happening is these receivers get into like either they call them either stacked or bunch, right? So stack would be
Mm-hmm.
2, bunch
Yeah,
would
they're
be
right on top
3.
of each other at the
Right,
3. Yep.
exactly. And then they kind of run little crisscrossy routes. So you want to play off to that because you're trying to sort that thing out, so you're not having to get picked and stuff like that because you still have a yard of legal pick play in the NFL. But there has to be a better mix of it, right? Like it can't just be
Yes.
every third down. We can't. It was tough to watch. It was
Well,
genuinely tough to watch, but I understand the struggles that they're having. But that's when it's like, all right, go talk to college coaches who are dealing with this and just like spend a month just doing that all summer because we got
and
to have a better answer.
it's twofold for me, because 3rd and 8 and playing off is different than 3rd and 3. All it is that little flash screen. The guy catches it,
Right.
takes 2 steps forward, and it's a first down, right? Like that.
Yeah.
And a lot of times it's not even, the stacked or the bunch that you were talking about there. The second thing is, when it comes to the defensive backs, you talked a lot about the miscommunication, and there was obviously miscommunication, not just within the secondary, but between Joe Barry and the secondary, period, last year. And I think that started with their defensive backs coach, who is no longer there as well. The
I was
quarterbacks
gonna
coach, who
say
is no longer
he
there.
left. He left.
Yes. But because obviously they couldn't get on the same page. They have Jair Alexander, who wants to shadow receivers. You let him shadow Justin Jefferson in the second to last game of the year, and it worked out, right? It just seems to me one of the reasons that Bill Belichick is, to me, the best coach of his generation, quite possibly the best coach of all time, is because he's constantly tweaking things to his personnel. Like Bill Belichick's never been one of those guys like, hey, this is what we do and this is how we do it here. No, he's constantly tweaking things. And when you have somebody who's as good in man coverage as Jair Alexander is, and then they play as little of man coverage as they did to play to the strength of one of their best players early in the season, those are the type of things where I think you start wondering, okay, is this the right coordinator to get it done? Right? Like those, because it's tough to know sometimes, even with blown coverage, whose
Right.
fault it necessarily is unless you know what the call is. You know,
Right.
there's one play I think of whenever I think of that in the 2015 playoff game against Arizona. Like Julius Peppers was like the closest guy to Larry Fitzgerald, and everyone blamed him, but it was somebody else who wasn't even on the screen that ended up blowing the coverage, and Peppers tried to cover for him. But for a while, everybody was mad at Peppers until like a coach cleared it up or whatever in the media and in the public. But there's just little things here and there where, okay, your secondary is supposed to be a strength of this team. They're not on the same page as your defensive coordinator. And then Joe Barry, the one time we get to talk to him this offseason, he steps to the podium and goes, oh, we don't have 10 weeks to mess around. Who's the one who was messing around, bud? Like that was look in the mirror. And those are the things that really frustrate me when it comes to Joe
Barry. I was on the same page as you, where I thought last year was going to be it, but for whatever reason, Matt LaFleur is riding with his guys. And I mean, even the hires that he ended up making, right? Like some of the big ones this past offseason, right? Greg Williams, the cornerbacks coach who came in and replaced.
Not the crazy Greg Williams with two G's. Just this is just this is a regular Greg Williams.
He worked under Joe Barry, right? So like, you know, all these guys that end up getting hired in Green Bay, outside of Bisaccia, basically has some sort of personal connection. He hired Tim Lester, who he was a quarterback with at Western Michigan, to be an analyst. He ended up, Lester got canned from being the head coach at his alma mater. So it'll be really interesting to see, like, if Matt can kind of swallow that pill, I guess. Because I guess if you think about it from this perspective, right, when he was brought in, the whole narrative was, right, the culture is changing. Both sides, the front office and the coaching staff report directly, to Mark Murphy instead of, the coaches reporting to the GM, right?
Mm-hmm.
And since then, it's come out that, pretty clearly Matt really wanted Aaron Rodgers to still continue to be the quarterback moving forward, and Goot won that battle. And then now we're going to be at a point where we're like, hey, you got to start firing your friends. Like, does that feel like an equal partnership at that point? I mean, that's as someone who's seen it a little bit on the inside in my brief cup of coffee in football, like the amount of political battles that happen would surprise you. Like, everything has to be, I'm the reason. It can't just be, I allowed us to succeed. It's, I'm the reason why we're succeeding. So I don't know how big his ego is in terms of that, but it would be seen in a certain way if he does have to start, letting go some of his friends in terms of that power dynamic.
Well, so that's a curious thing to me. And I think that's the next two seasons are going to prove whether or not this structure can actually work for the Green Bay Packers. Like when Mark Murphy's gone in 2 years, I'm really curious to see what the next president does, because for the longest time, president hires GM. GM runs everything in the football, including the hiring of the head coach. And the trickle down worked for so long here in Green Bay. Ron Wolf wouldn't have taken the job unless they changed the structure to that. So it just seems that the messaging, they're missing each other. You kind of mentioned where LaFleur and Gutekunst don't necessarily seem to be on the same page. Goody's sitting up there during press conferences saying, well, no, our standards don't change. This isn't a rebuild. This is Green Bay. We don't change anything we do. And LaFleur's going, hey, when it comes to my quarterback, let's pump the brakes. Let's kind of manage our expectations here. So they're not even on the same page in terms of how they want to message what's going on inside 1265.
The love messaging has been pretty funny to me, because they're like, I don't know, let's pump the brakes on hyping this kid up. It's like, you showed Aaron Rodgers the door. You're probably going to have 2 first-round picks in next year's draft, which is like the quarterback draft. I know people
Yep.
talk about how people say like every year is supposed to be the next best quarterback draft, and I don't even agree with that. I think that's been a recent trend, like just in like the past 3 years. And if you look at the draft classes, they're probably right. But so Caleb Williams, Drake May are as good of quarterback prospects as we've seen since Trevor Lawrence, and that was what 2020. That was COVID year, I'm pretty
Yeah.
sure.
Yep. Yeah,
Um,
it was the same draft as Jordan Love.
yeah, so I mean, if you're talking about blue chip prospects, like they got to get an answer out of Jordan Love, and I'm sure that's part of the reason why they didn't give him that fully guaranteed 5th year option too. It's because like, hey, we kind of have options right now, so I do think there's more, you know. I don't want to get this bleep. Take a dump or get off the pot. To this Jordan Love plan than people assume. And I'm not rooting against Jordan or anything like that.
No.
He has like 60 passes. I'm not going to make a judgment on him, but their options certainly are open if you just kind of like look at the layout of everything.
Well, which is why it's really interesting to me when you take a look at what the Packers are talking about this offseason, right? Like you have Gutekunst up there saying, hey, no, this isn't a rebuild, yet he's the one who said, hey, if you have a championship roster, you have a championship kicker. They drafted Anders Carlson and they let, they let Mason Crosby walk out the door, which again is fine. But then you're ready to move on to Jordan Love. And part of the reason why you trade Aaron Rodgers, don't even try to, convince him to stick around. And then you don't give him the 5th year option. You give him, some money up front, but with all the incentives that are in there, it seems very impossible, very difficult for Love to end up making the money he would have made guaranteed off the 5th year option. So even he's keeping his options open as to what the future of this team is going to be. He's saying one thing, Gutekunst is, yet his actions are leading us down a different path.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, you kind of have to operate like, hey, nothing's going to change here. The culture is going to continue to roll. We're the Packers, right? But then at the same time, you're like, I got to cover my ass at some point.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of feels what he's doing, because not only he has to be good enough in the next 2 years. Like this is these next 2 years are just so huge for both him and the floor, where they prove that they're worth whatever. When hey, whoever takes over next after Mark Murphy, because they're going to be making the hiring and firing decisions of the general manager, of the head coach. How many times do you see it? There's a regime change within an organization. They want their guys running the show. Well, if you're good enough, they'll keep you around. But if you're mediocre, next president probably comes in and goes, we haven't really been getting it done. I want my guys in there. Let's go.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things, too, is just from the front office perspective, I think this happens a lot less on the coaching side. But just that pipeline of front office talent. I know people make jokes about, Goot's run in like the 3rd round and how he hasn't drafted a half decent 3rd rounder. And yeah, that can be kind of frustrating. But
half decent is like he hasn't drafted a good player. Like he's Jay Sternberger, Amari Rodgers.
I'm hoping Tucker Kraft might be the one, dude.
Yeah, hey, look,
really
we're all holding the hope that Sean Ryan can be a contributor this year. The 3rd round picks are unbelievable.
Yeah, but just that pipeline of like homegrown talent that they end up getting from that front office, where it's just guys just slowly move up, and some of them end up taking GM jobs elsewhere and stuff like that. Like I wonder what kind of disruption would happen to that if they ended up making a major switch at general manager. But I agree with you that 2023, I think it's a lot less about what they put on the field and more just like, are things trending in the right direction? And then 2024, I think, is when it's like, all right, well, we should be back, right? Like you had a 2.5 year rollout for this thing, go win some ball games, and I still don't even really think that they're going to be overall the cap situation that they've kind of built up over multiple seasons. And part of it was the pandemic, part of it is pushing for a title. I mean, think about it. Like at the trade deadline, we were talking about giving up a 1st-round pick for DJ Moore. We were talking about a 2nd-round pick for Chase Claypool. I mean, I'm happy they didn't make those moves, right? Like looking back, because think about how stretched thin this roster would be with another major contract on it already.
Yeah.
So
I mean, just based on some of the stuff that I've seen online, Ken Ingles, of course, does a great job with the Packers cap, all that sort of
yeah,
stuff on Twitter. Like, based on what he's kind of put out there, 2024, they're going to be healthier.
yeah,
But like 2025 is going to be the year they
yeah,
kind of become fully healthy, because you look at the contracts of David Bakhtiari and Aaron Jones, who they both redid this year. Jones actually taking less money, Bakhtiari just moving money around. Both those guys are going to have pretty significant dead cap numbers next season.
yeah.
It's not going to be the Aaron Rodgers 40 million that you're dealing with this year, but there's still going to be some of that navigation plus void years that have carried over from past guys. There's still going to be a lot of dead cap money on that 2024 cap. I think 25 is really the year to kind of look forward. So we had you on, Justice, when we did packed lunch after the season. Unfortunately, came to a close after the Detroit Lions game. And as we head to the end of the offseason program here, what was your favorite move of the offseason? As you sit back here, and there have been so many things that have happened with the Green Bay Packers, what has been your favorite move of the offseason?
Let me think. I mean, it's got to be Matt Orzek, right? The long snapper coming in. It's got to be him. I'm hoping I'm
that's
saying
that's
his
that's
name
the
right.
one you were hoping for. That's the
Oh
one.
yeah, top guy
You
on my
just
draft board, on my free agent board. No, you know, I really like Lucas Van Ness, and
okay.
I know a lot of people see the like zero starts thing. I think that's baloney. I
Yeah.
think it's completely baloney. I watch the games he plays as much as the other two guys who are like COVID redshirt guys, right? Like
Yeah.
they've just been in the program forever. I'm happy they didn't mess up that pick because I thought he was kind of like the right guy on the board. I thought Darnell Washington and him were probably the most like highlight, underline, like they look like Packers type of guys in this draft class in the draft range that they were at in. And then the other guy I would say is Tucker Kraft. You mentioned him already, the third round pick, tight end out of South Dakota State. I think it wouldn't surprise me if he looked a lot better than Luke Musgrave in year one, just because I think he can do a little bit of everything. And, the thing you can hang your hat on is broken tackles. And I know he's coming from the FCS, but that's where I think you see the big difference between him and Musgrave. Musgrave, I think he goes down on contact basically immediately. The thing with Musgrave is he's just so good at being able to separate at that size. Like he can run dig routes and like separate against NFL athlete corners. I just don't know if Musgrave is going to be there fully year one, and they're going to need a tight end. And I don't know if Musgrave can do the inline stuff. So I wouldn't be surprised if Tucker Kraft got out there a little bit more than people expect.
So that's the thing that concerns me. And look, they had to draft tight ends. It just
Yeah.
and concerns probably the wrong word. But when it comes to tempering at least the expectations I'm trying to have for the Packers going forward, and maybe some of this is colored because of the guy I do the morning show with, former Packers tight end Mark Chmura. And I know he's half joking when he says this, but after quarterback, tight end's one of the toughest offensive positions to learn, because
Yeah.
wide receivers, you got to know the route tree, you got to know all that, route combinations. Offensive linemen, it's either pass block or all of these different run combinations. Tight end, you need to know all of those things because you're doing a little bit of everything. And that information can just be, it's coming at you so fast. It can just overload your system a little bit. So when you take a look back at, wide receivers have had great rookie years. We've seen that recently in the NFL. Tight ends, not as much. Even guys like Kyle
Yeah.
Pitts, who have been drafted in the top 10. Some of that is the quarterback play that they end up playing with is subpar. Some of that is, as a tight end, so much information is being thrown at you. It takes a year or two to kind of get everything underneath you before you can play at a speed that you're used to. So especially when it comes to those two, I'm hoping to see a flash play or two where I can get excited about what they're going to do in 24 or 25. I guess my expectations for both those guys just – they're not very high based on what Chewy has told me about playing tight end in the NFL.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with that at all. You got to remember those long play calls, right?
Mm-hmm.
Each one of those words is basically just telling a receiver what to do. And they just got to key in on like the one word that tells them what to do, right? tight end, you got to do everything. And, center's doing the mic point, safeties rotate, like that changes up the geometry of the whole run play and stuff like that. So you got to make all those adjustments. I think Kraft, the way they used him at South Dakota State was really interesting. And that's why I have a little bit more faith in him. Is like they kind of ran the offense through him. It was fun to watch. Like they would run little screens and stuff to him when he was healthy and all sorts of stuff. So I just wouldn't be surprised if Kraft was the guy who, one, broke that third round curse, and then two, if he got some early looks over Musgrave. And if he does, I don't think that means the Musgrave plan isn't going well either, because the whole thing on Musgrave is like, we're taking a flyer on a guy that we think could be like Darren Waller, right? And
Mm-hmm.
like we know he's not ready right now, but like 2.5 years ahead of time, like that's what we're betting on, and that's was always the lottery pick that his selection was.
Yeah, I think my favorite move was probably Lucas Van Ness because, like you, I was kind of worried about. Okay, now you did the pick swap. What are you going to do? You moved up. I didn't have a problem with them going after a pass rusher there because when you take a look at the list of guys that lead the league in sacks every year, a lot of them are first round picks that have that elite athleticism that you can only find in the first round.
It's the easiest position to scout, bar none, because it's can you get a baseline level of production, and are you a freak athlete? Like that's consistently what translates at the NFL level at the edge position, and it makes a lot of sense because you're just hanging out there doing the dance against a 300-pounder, and you got to get to the quarterback as fast as possible in a league where quarterbacks are just getting the ball out of their hand so quick now. So yeah, I'm with you. I never really got them going in another direction until late. They started inviting a lot of those tackles. And then like I started watching like Darnell Washington and stuff like that, and was like, oh, this guy's really interesting. I actually talked to or Darnell Wright, sorry. There's two Darnells in this class. And then I talked to his agent, and he was like, yeah, Green Bay might be a spot, but Chicago's another team that's looking at him. And lo and behold, he ends up going to Chicago right before Green Bay.
So we talked about favorite. What was your least favorite move of the offseason?
Ooh, that
It
one
doesn't
is,
have to be a specific player or anything. I
yeah.
would just say for me, it was the lack of adding a veteran pass catcher. And maybe they still do that. But and I don't even think they need, somebody who's going to step in and be the wide receiver one. I just want somebody who's going to be a veteran leader in that locker room. Because
Yeah.
if your plan going into the regular season is a bunch of first and second year guys plus Josiah DeGuara, like that just I need some leadership in one of those rooms, man. Like I need somebody. I just need some sort of veteran presence that can help bring these guys along.
Yeah. I think I'm gonna go in a different direction from you, but kind of in the same vein, like not adding like some sort of vet D lineman. I mean, we're
Mm-hmm.
we're basically banking now, right? That it's gonna be Wyatt, and then Wyatt, who hasn't started football games, right? At 3-4 end. TJ Slayton starting at nose tackle, something again he hasn't done, and then Kenny Clark probably moving from nose tackle to defensive end just to get him a starting line. And I know, LaFleur was asked in the post practice presser about who's standing out in OTAs, and he mentioned Kobe Wooden and Carl Brooks, the two draft pick kids that they ended up taking in the third round. But I mean, the pads haven't even come on really. I mean, they're in helmets, but they're not in shoulder pads and stuff. So I would figure that you're not going to learn a whole ton about these young defensive linemen without pads being on and the physicality being ramped up. So like we're one injury away from one of those guys starting 17 games. You know what I mean? So that's the one position where I'm like, I don't know. Could be bad, and it could be bad for 17 games.
Oh man. Oh. And there, I mean, I guess at least Dalvin Cook's not in the division anymore, right? So I mean, he can't just rip
I
up the
would have
defensive
welcomed
line.
last year's Dalvin Cook.
That's
Could have kept
fair.
coming back.
That's
Keep
fair.
paying him.
Oh man, yeah, the defensive line is just such a and look, safety as well, right? Like they
Mhm.
maybe Darnell Savage returns to form. I highly doubt it because we've been waiting for it for 2 years at this point. So
Yeah.
I can't imagine a third year is going to end up being a big difference. Well, we've gone a half hour, Justice, and we somehow haven't really brought up the name Jordan Love, other than the messaging coming from the front
Right.
office. What do you think are the next steps? What do you think is the realistic expectation that you have for Jordan Love at the beginning of the season?
Just look like a competent quarterback in that system. Like I feel like we've all seen it. Like, um, back when Goff was with the Rams, right? And they were doing way more of that under center boot action stuff than what they did with Stafford. San Francisco just rolling through those guys like the quarterback position doesn't even matter. Just look competent enough that what is it, John Madden? Matriculate the ball down the field. Like that's all I'm trying to see. I watched a video that Kurt Warner did. He actually did like this 2-part video series on YouTube breaking down Jordan Love's film. One of them was a preseason game. The other one was his throws against the Eagles, which his biggest extended look we've seen since the weird Kansas City Chiefs game. And he does seem to like force the hole shots. Like he's really aggressive up the sideline, and maybe that's just the backup quarterback in him trying to show coach something,
Hey,
right?
yep.
Like that's a real thing. Like remember Kristen Michael returning kicks? That
Oh
was the
yeah.
same thing to me. I was like, I don't trust this kid. This kid is trying to impress coach every single time. Like he has way too much to gain with like a flashy play than I trust him
That
to ever do
is
the check down.
Christian Mike is such a deep cut. Like that is exactly what I want out of this Pack Lunch podcast is for you to drop a name like that and somebody watching go, yes, I know exactly what Justice is talking about. Because I like you said it, I'm like, where's he going with it? Oh yeah, that's right. When he was returning kicks, it was just
Yeah.
brutal. Just brutal.
It was terrible. So I don't think Love has been bad, but like that whole shot with Aaron Jones down the sideline against the Eagles, I know a lot of people clip that and are like, wow, he really tried this. And like Aaron Jones didn't come down with it and it was a good throw. But there are a couple more of those, in some of the preseason games and stuff. And it's like, all right, we don't got to win every single one of these. Like, let's just take a check down every once in a while and get out of there. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the offense looks like because just from like a structural standpoint, like Love isn't like a 4-4 guy, but
Nope.
like they do seem to run the option a whole lot more with him, like even in preseason games and stuff like that. I think he could do plenty of the RPO stuff. They said, they were checking out the film from Miami and San Francisco last year to see, kind of how they got their quarterbacks to play so much better than, whatever the assumptions were coming into the season, right, of Tua and Brock Purdy. I think Miami's really on the cutting edge of a lot of this like RPO stuff. I mean, they're able to do some of it from under center. I don't know if they would do it if they had a right-handed quarterback, just because it looks so weird coming out of Tua's hand. But if the Packers could bring some of that to the offense, I mean, that would be very cool to be on the cutting edge of offensive football with a quarterback
Yes.
who's semi-fast.
That would be super fun. But again, this is where I go back to not having a veteran wide receiver.
Yeah.
I think of when Brett first came in, he had Sterling. And if you ask me, Sterling Sharp should be in the Football Hall of Fame. Like if we could put Terrell Davis there because his career was shortened, Sterling Sharp deserves to be there. When Aaron first came in, like, yeah, you had a young Greg Jennings, but you had a pretty established Donald Driver who ended up going on and breaking every receiving record in Packers franchise history. So you had a veteran presence that was going to help Brett, that was going to help Aaron. And yeah, they also had some young guys to grow with, but not having that veteran guy that can help kind of build some confidence, like, okay, this play broke down, where do I go? Right now, that guy's, I guess, Romeo Doubs, based on the reporting that's out there, that they seem to have this chemistry. Maybe he ends up being wide receiver 1. Christian Watson ends up being 2. Doesn't really matter personally to me, but having just somebody that can be that security blanket, because I don't know who that is right now in this offense. Like, who's that guy that you can rely on? It's something that I think can help build confidence. Yes, at times it can be a crutch, but I don't mind that as the offense continues to grow, because there are going to be a lot of growing pains as receivers run wrong routes, they get the play call wrong, whatever it is. And that's just what has me the most concerned about not having a veteran wide receiver is not being able to kind of help build along that confidence that Jordan Love's going to need.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting because I think, it's going to have to come from the coaching staff and then the handful of vets that are on the offensive side of the ball. Like, I don't know, maybe it's like Bakhtiari and Aaron Jones. Like, maybe it's not a wide receiver that's, buddies with him. But I mean, Bach was pretty close to Aaron, so I don't know how that whole relationship works with Love.
Well,
I
and
don't
he's
know if
only
they're
going to be
going to be
around for
sharing
a
the golf
year.
cart.
Yeah.
He is
He's
only
only
going. Yeah, I think he's counting down the days. He's talking like he's counting down the days.
It seems like it, yes. It very much seems like it. The way, but again, that's just Bakhtiari being Bakhtiari. The way he's been outspoken this offseason, that's part of what you get, I think, with him, which I like. I personally mind. I don't mind. If I'm Brian Gutekunst, then I'm trying to sit there, not a rebuild, not a rebuild. And the left tackle is saying, yeah, no, this is a rebuild. What are you guys talking about? Well, yeah, I can understand how that'd be frustrating as a member of the Packers front office. But as we head out of off-season team workouts, and again, the mandatory minicamp is this week for the Green Bay Packers, and we start heading towards training camp at the end of July. What makes you most optimistic about this team? What are you most optimistic about when it comes to the 2023 Green Bay Packers?
I think the offense is probably going to get better with like every quarter of the season, right? So like the first 4 weeks, probably going to have some rough patches. And then from there, I think it's just going to trend up. And then the other thing too is I really do think like the pass defense is actually going to be pretty solid. I mean, they're 4 deep at corner. Safety, at least there's, veteran competition there, right? I mean, they have 4 guys going after it to the point that like the rookie draft pick isn't even really in the conversation. And then they have 3 legit pass rushers. And even the guys that they drafted to play 3-4 end are a little bit more pass rushery types than what they've had before. I think Green Bay's kind of weird from the defensive structure. They play a lot of what people call penny, which is basically like the 3-4, but you sub out a linebacker when most teams would have subbed out an interior defensive lineman, which is cool because, like, okay, you still have your defensive front. No one's going to run inside zone on you, and you have a nickel on the field. That's nice. The problem is you have 3 defensive linemen, 300-pounders who are rushing the passer every single time that they, throw out 11 personnel or whatever. And that's kind of where I thought the Packers struggled a little bit last year, which is like Reed and Lowry just weren't giving you any juice as pass rushers. So hopefully when Brooks, maybe Clark moving out to the end, that helps a little bit. And, Lucas Van Ness being able to move around certainly should be able to help. Because, I mean, that's one thing we didn't touch on. I think Van Ness is a little bit more of a chess piece than Gary and Preston Smith, kind of almost in the same vein as like Zadarius Smith.
So that's what I guess I'm most optimistic about. I'm not optimistic about the Packers actually using some of these guys this way, but I feel that defensively, they've got a lot of guys that can kind of be moved around. You mentioned, I mean, really across the defensive line, Kenny Clark can play anywhere there. You mentioned them kind of shifting him out to defensive end instead of being nose tackle. Quay Walker's the one I'm most excited about.
Yeah.
When you get the position coach up there and somebody asks about, putting him outside to get some pass rushes in, and he doesn't really answer the question because he doesn't want anyone to know that that's what they're doing. Like they have, he's really versatile, and that makes me excited. You can put Jair; he's better on the outside. You can put him on the slot. You mentioned Lucas Van Ness. I just think that they have some really cool pieces defensively, and if everybody can get on the same page, I think they could have some cool looks. Now, whether or not those looks work out, I think that at least they can put some cool things together defensively.
Yeah, I mean, it should be fun. Have you followed the Tariq Carpenter stuff? He
Yes.
said that at one point last year they had him. He was a college safety who moved to linebacker during the All-Star games and ended up, being listed as a linebacker now. But they moved him to outside linebacker at some point during the season. That's edge. I mean, a college safety playing Rashawn Gary's position. Like they're willing to get weird, and I appreciate that about them.
Yeah, let's get funky. Tariq Carpenter usually, I mean, mostly just a special teamer, but hey, try some different things, and I think they have those pieces to do it. So that's what I'm optimistic about. Just because I still don't know offensively. I have my doubts that both Dobbs and Watson are going to just like continue to blossom and just be both of them be stud wide receivers because
I'm really
it
worried about Dobbs,
seems
actually.
you're worried about Dobbs because I feel like he's been getting all the love this offseason as
I
being the
know, but
one. So I haven't heard much about Christian Watson. So I guess I'm more optimistic about Dobbs than I am
yeah.
than Watson at this point.
I just worry that second half of the season, and this was even a little bit before the ankle injury, because obviously, a guy comes back from an injury like that where he's out for multiple weeks, like he might look different his rookie year. But even just like right before his ankle injury, teams are just getting in his face and just pressing the hell out of him, and he
Yeah.
didn't really have an answer. And if it's going to be interesting to see how they use these guys, right? Because Christian Watson, I think ideally you want as the Z, which is like the off-ball receiver.
Yep.
So like line him up with Jaden Reed in the slot, and you don't know who's running the deep route, right? Or you can have Watson be the jet guy if he's off the ball, or he can be like the end around guy. Well, what role does that leave Dobbs in if Reed is playing the slot and Watson is playing the Z? Well, then he has to play the X where he's isolated and pressed every single play. So that's where I'm like, I almost wonder if like a guy like Wicks, who I mean, he hasn't had like a crazy OTAs or anything like that. I haven't seen a ton of hype from him, but just in terms of like that big body, more physical receiver would kind of fit with Watson and Reed's skill set better than like a Dobbs, where like maybe Dobbs is like the Randall Cobb type of guy. Like he comes in on third downs, just like catching stuff underneath. But I guess we'll figure it out. We got a lot of learning to do.
Yes, and they are going to try to continue to figure it out. Justice, I want to say thank you so much for jumping on. Tell everybody where they can catch all the great work that you're doing when it comes to the Green Bay Packers.
Yeah. AcmePackingCompany.com. You can subscribe to our podcast feed wherever you can find your podcast. And then personally on Twitter at JUMOSQ.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff on Twitter. If you want to be following somebody fun on Twitter, I certainly suggest Justice. Justice, appreciate the time. Thank you so much for jumping on Packed Lunch.
Anytime, my man.
Tomorrow we will be back at noon Central Time. John Anderson of ESPN from Green Bay, from the great state of Wisconsin. He'll break down the Packers offseason with us tomorrow right here on ESPN Wisconsin.